which is coming out very soon, right? Right, very soon. And mid-century modern sounds like a really easy kind of topic, but I think he's going to complicate it for us very quickly. He has cautioned us that there is about a 5-minute passage in his lecture where we're deep in the weeds. So we must be patient as he tries to unpack a lot of these abstractions that need to be gotten through so he can get to the point of his talk. So I know that we're all up to that challenge. He also has given me permission to mention that he's right now working on an interesting side project related to the Eames and to the history of mid-century modern in the form of a 6-part series that is being produced by the company associated with Mark Wahlberg. And he's going to be doing, he's writing the actual script, and he's going to be featured as a voiceover. I'm, of course, encouraging him to be featured literally in this 6-part miniseries, but he doesn't seem to be up for that. But anyway, so this is a really exciting occasion for us, and I'm glad that we'll be able to have Todd for this very special talk, and hopefully he'll come back and speak to us again next year. So please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
I want to thank very much my gracious hosts, once again, Ike Hang, for the invitation to speak here tonight, and also to Michelle West for seamlessly guiding me through my travels here today. I also want to thank David Hertzgaard at the Eames office for providing me with some really superb, rare photographs that I will get to share with you this afternoon. So yes, I guess my point today is going to be to say that the familiar, insofar as familiar mid-century modern that we think about in either Sotheby's or Crate & Barrel or Target or Walmart, or where it seems ubiquitous these days, was a much, much stranger phenomenon than we think. I guess that's my point to say. So it's going to get strange about 3/4 of the way through, and I will signal that, and it will be totally obvious. All right. So for those of you that were here last week, I spoke about the great cutout works by Henri Matisse, and there I was trying to show the consistent patterns that informed his late period work, roughly from 1940 to his death in 1954. It may seem that the subject of my talk today, the mid-century modern work of Richard Neutra and Charles and Ray Eames, emerges from a totally different artistic universe than post-war France. As it turns out, Charles and Ray Eames were great admirers of Matisse's work. You see a poster here on the wall of the Eames studio of the 1966 Matisse retrospective at UCLA. You can see it on the back wall there. Ray Eames had studied with the great abstract expressionist Hans Hofmann in the 1930s, and her early painting, sculpture, and decorative designs were inspired by Hofmann's work as well as the contemporary cutouts of Matisse. This photograph in their Richard Neutra designed apartment shows one of Ray Eames's lost biomorphic cutout works, a suspended and reversible modular screen. You see it hanging here in opposite orientation, so she's kind of flipped it around. Likely constructed out of tinfoil and paper, although it's a bit unclear, so it's reflective, it seems. As you'll also notice, the screen is brought to life by a hidden light source at bottom left, which projects a complex shadow play along the walls. It's quite avant-garde. Matisse's cutouts seem again very much on Ray's mind with this 1943 cover for California Arts and Architecture. Here, the complex interplay of flatness and depth is generated by the precise figure ground ambiguities utilizing only 4 colors. I won't dwell any further on this cross-continental avant-garde moment, but I do want to suggest that mid-century modern is anything but a regional concern. Charles and Ray Eames arrived into Los Angeles from the Cranbrook Academy in Michigan, in July of 1941. Upon his arrival, Charles worked for 9 months in the drawing office at the art department of MGM Studios. Charles likely got the position at MGM with the help of Katharine Hepburn, who was friends with Charles's client Irene Rich. Irene Rich's daughter, Frances, was a student at Cranbrook Academy, and the Eameses produced drawings for a never-realized guest house at Rich's home here in Santa Barbara. Now, unfortunately, I do not have a slide of those designs. Those are very rare and almost never seen. But Charles and Ray's first trip to California was to Santa Barbara to design this guest house for Irene Rich. By September of 1941, the Eameses had moved into the Strathmore apartments, designed by Richard Neutra in 1937. This is Ray Eames leaning out the balcony. Comprising 8 units in 4 buildings next to UCLA in Westwood, the Strathmore apartments are representative expressions of Neutra's 1930s design principles. The structure is modular in design, based on a 3-foot by 3.5-inch unit, determined by the width of the standard steel casement, a width that also happened to correspond to the traditional module of Japanese architecture. Although it is modular in construction, the structure is not, in fact, given any expressive weight, and that's normal for Neutra. As Neutra put it at the time, it would be far-fetched to symbolize in the surface of a structure the nature of its construction. The exterior should give no hint as to how it's made. So as I'll show, the Eameses took a very different approach to structure. I think this is a defining characteristic of their differences. The Strathmore apartments were immensely popular and attracted a celebrity clientele, including Dolores Del Rio, Orson Welles, Louise Rayner, who you see here, Louise Rayner and Clifford Odets, and later John Entenza, the editor of Arts and Architecture magazine. As it turns out, we have a remarkable set of visual and written records by the Eameses where they document their experiences at the apartment. Ray published an article in Mademoiselle's Living under the title, "We Live in One of the Newest Houses in California." Ray describes their home as an empty shell, one that imposes no style on the tenants, but leaves them free to create their own surroundings through color, texture, use of area and objects, and equipment needed for everyday life and activities. Ray is closely echoing here Neutra's own sentiments. Neutra reflected how new architecture provides more and more space for the planning and enjoyment of artistic creation. It will furnish peaceful, even vacant backgrounds, non-competitive settings, breathing room, space for the explosion of an art object. And this is precisely how the Eameses used the apartment as an all-purpose art and design studio. The Eameses famously turned their apartment into a furniture workshop, and it was there that they designed some of the most iconic early molded plywood furniture. You can see some of it in here and on the page on the left. Early on, Ray described their design intention as the attempt to make good design available to many people at lower cost. The Eameses would later turn this idea into their very famous motto, the best for the most for the least. Alongside Ray's article, we have a written letter by Charles to Neutra in March of 1949 after living in the apartment for 7 years. Charles writes how the apartment affected everyone who lived there. The apartments you have developed here have given each tenant the opportunity to develop his surroundings in the most expansive way, each feeling that he is living within his own garden and has complete privacy. Neutra was so touched by this letter that he referred back to it as a love letter in his 1962 autobiography, Life and Shape, and I'll come back to this in a minute. At the same moment Charles was writing his letter to Neutra, he and Ray had purchased a plot of land from their friend John Entenza, a meadow with eucalyptus trees in the Pacific Palisades overlooking the ocean at the edge of the Santa Monica Bay. It is here that they built their famous house. The house was conceived in 1945 as part of the great Case Study House program, sponsored by Arts and Architecture magazine. Case Study House number 8 was heavily publicized in the magazine and inaugurated a new vision of modern domestic architecture. To get a sense of the innovations at the Eames house, we might compare it with the modern houses built just prior to it. The first 4 years of the case study program were dominated by houses made in traditional materials of wood frame with plaster, brick, and wood siding. This is case study house number 20 by Neutra. As it turns out, not only was case study number 20 built just prior to the Eames house, but it's built on the same stretch of land. It's the neighboring plot to the north, I couldn't find a slide where you can see both of them, but they are right next door. It's a 2-bedroom house of redwood and plaster with an L-shaped plan. The living room and the dining room open along the south side to a patio shaded by a giant eucalyptus. The two bedrooms have their own garden spaces to the west, with a prefabricated utility core at the knuckle of the structure near the entrance. Over the next 10 years, the house was expanded 3 times to include 2 bedrooms and a pool along the northern extension. The most obvious point of contrast between case study 20, or the Bailey house, and the Eames house is in the materials. The Eames house, there on the left, and the Bailey is on the right. The Eames house is made of steel decking and plaster panels over a steel frame. The frame comprises 4-inch H columns and 12-inch open web steel beams that are divided into 8 bays, each 7.5 by 20 feet. The court between the house and the studio has 4 bays, and the studio 5. Neutra's materials, by contrast, are quite traditional: redwood, plaster, brick, and glass. This is striking because Neutra was, of course, an early innovator, one of the first innovators in the steel-framed house. He famously used a steel frame for his first house in the United States, the Lovell Health House of 1927-29. This is in Los Feliz. But this structural technology was not made thematic in the house itself, as plaster covers all the major structural elements, and that was purposeful. This slide here shows the steel framework of the Lovell House on the left, next to the Eames house on the right of 20 years later. The Eameses made the skeleton an expressive part of the design. In their original design for their house, the Eameses explored a less emphatic structural format. It's a bridge form built between 2 trusses, a kind of box beam. The structure rested on 2 steel supports with the box cantilevering out beyond them, while the house hangs over terraces and through its raised perch offers a direct view to the sea. When the steel arrived at the meadow, the Eameses had a distinct change of heart and came up with an entirely new plan using the exact same materials. Where before they were using the largest amount of steel to enclose the smallest amount of space, the new design created the largest enclosure they could create with the same materials. So they kind of reversed gear here. In the end, they created a much larger space, 2,500 square feet, for a house and studio, a space that is well more than double the size of the Bailey house, the case study house next door. Here's how Charles described the new design. The structural approach became an expansive one in that it encouraged use of space as such beyond the optimum requirements of living, end quote. I think this is a kind of highly coded phrase by Charles. Both ideas, structural approach and optimum requirements of living, were directed, I think, at Neutra. I want to point to 3 elements that I think differentiate Neutra's approach from that of the Eameses. First, as I mentioned, Neutra was uninterested in structural expression. Second, it was Neutra's long-standing view that modern housing should be based in what he called biorealist principles. The question Neutra repeatedly asked was, what were the optimum requirements for a home to satisfy biological necessities? And Neutra borrowed a term from his friend Walter Gropius at the Bauhaus to describe this optimization ideal, this optimization of the house. He called it a minimum existence dwelling. As Neutra explained his working process, this is what he says: plans are prepared and experimental studies are carried on during a period of years until the most reasonable and economical solution of the problems were decided upon. Neutra would work with a series of charts to determine the most efficient solution to the parameters, and he'd have charts for these: size, area, cube, cost, and rent. What Neutra's experiments proved was that literal size was unrelated to perceptual size. It's the perceptual expansion, the sense of expanded space, that humans required, not square footage. In Neutra's words, physiological spaciousness was more important than mere geometrical size. He says this very frequently. Third point, Neutra always thought of his houses as at least potentially an object of industrial production. Neutra saw the case study program as something that he had been anxiously looking forward to for many long years, as it was the beginning of the process of mass-produced housing. The Eameses, by contrast, rejected the idea of their house as a model for mass production. While it is certainly true that the Eames house is emphatic in its use of standardized industrial parts, more so than Neutra, it's fully off the rack, the actual arrangement of their house, the Eameses said, was highly personal, and whether or not it solves the particular requirements of many families is not important as a case study. These 3 points of divergence between the Eameses and Neutra, materials, spatial concept, and about material prefabrication, these differences grew much wider, I think, as the years went on. Still in 1950, Neutra was not far from the Eameses' thinking. Here is a fascinating 1950 photograph of the Herman Miller Furniture Showroom with a large mural on the back there. A large mural of Neutra's own home, the VDL Research House, it's in Silver Lake, appearing along the far wall, just beyond a Giacometti sculpture. I think the juxtaposition of the sculpture with the mural reflects their experience as Strathmore, with the house as a background, an empty shell if you like, for the explosive display of art and furniture. 4 years later, the Eameses and Neutra, along with George Nelson, Robert Motherwell, and Richard Lippold, were invited by the West German Foreign Ministry to visit the country as part of a cultural exchange program. This right here is a photograph taken by Charles of Richard and Dione Neutra in the back of their touring bus in Germany. I can only speculate on the nature of their discussions, but I can say that things grew more tense between them in the years that followed. In a letter to the German foreign minister, Charles wrote that he was most interested in German folk arts, including games, festivals, music, and especially mathematics and toys. During their short trip in Germany, the Eameses assembled materials for an 11-minute film called Two Baroque Churches, as well as a 32-pass, 96-image slideshow of a Munich pastry shop called Konditorei. So what, you might ask, do pastries, Baroque architecture, and modern design have to do with one another? According to Charles, this is what he says, the pastry is a contemporary example of the Baroque style of architecture of the early 18th century in southern Germany, which he calls light, humorous, wonderfully thought out, and highly mathematical, end quote. Moreover, he said he would like to feed the pastry by spoon to today's students of architecture and design. There are a lot of leaps of logic here: Baroque, pastry, festival, toys, humor, math, modern architecture, education. And if you want to understand the Eameses, it's in tracing the underlying connection between these dizzying, and I think purposely dizzying leaps in scale, content, and logic. So what I want to do is single out 5 central qualities of the Eamesian approach at large. This is, I think, holds for most all of their work. The first is care. What the pastry shop and the Baroque church share in common is a commitment to quality, of immense and loving care down to the last detail. What Charles wanted to spoon-feed the architecture student is what it looks and feels like to show infinite care for and attention to one's work. The Eameses believed that quality was contagious, that care begets more care. Second, the necessity to have a clear set of constraints to fulfill a task to its fullest. As these images suggest, making a pastry is a precise operation, something that follows a strict set of protocols passed down from the Konditor Meister to apprentices. Third, and most difficult to grasp, has to do with mathematics. Although there's a mass of information on display in an Eames film or slideshow, there are 24 images on the screen right now, and typically they would flash by at a very quick rate. What one was supposed to take away from the deluge of images was an underlying pattern, a pattern that told you something essential about the product. The fourth point, I'll come back to these, the play with pattern was itself pleasurable. There is joy in the manipulation of models. 5, the last point, the fact that these mini edible works of art disappeared after use made them a kind of ideal object for the Eameses, something that would retain their lasting value by virtue of their disappearing. They could never be corrupted once they were consumed. I want to show you now another instance of this set of 5 principles, an excerpt from the great multi-screen film entitled Think, shown in 1964-65 at the World's Fair in New York City. The excerpt is called The Dinner Party Sequence, and it stars Joan Shawley, who appeared in the Eameses' very close friend Billy Wilder's films Some Like It Hot and The Apartment. And you'll see Wilder's wife, Audrey Wilder, makes a brief appearance as the vamp near the end. So this is about, 2 minutes. We tried it a few minutes ago. Let's see.
Using the clicker to fast forward.
No.
This one. The mouse.
Mm-hmm. Oh, maybe that'll work.
The problem that follows is closer to our everyday experience, but the steps toward its solution are very much the same.
The Hartmans are back. Now we just have to give that party. Let's see, the 25th is Harry's birthday. That's a week from Thursday. Now, Harry's boss and his wife will be here Friday, and we really should give it for them. And it should be black tie. They'd enjoy meeting the McKnights. And I almost forgot Dr. Schlosser. Where's that list? The Coopers will be fun. Harry's sister and her husband. Was that due to the seating? Let's see, Jane is on Harry's left, Mrs. Townsend's on the right, Mr. Townsend on my right, and Steve here. Mimi Cooper next to Mr. Townsend. Now she'll talk his ear off. I'll put her next to Steve. He's a little hard of hearing. George McKnight here, Alice Hartman and Dr. Schlosser. Now he's apt to pinch Mrs. Townsend. I'll put him next to me. And move Steve between Mimi Cooper and Alice Hartman. And I'll put George McKnight next to Mrs. Townsend, and on the other side, Virginia McKnight and Charlie Cooper. That puts him opposite Steve. No, not after that incident last Saturday. I'll raise the centerpiece. That leaves Sam Hartman. Wait a minute. Now, how many do I have? I have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 13? I'll have to invite another girl. Cleo Fenwick will be back from Reno by then. No, the wives wouldn't like that. I guess I better scratch Dr. Schlosser.
She stated her problem, abstracted the essentials, tried out the relationships, and made her decision.
So I think that's a very, very characteristic film by the Eameses. They made many, many films, and I think that's about as representative as I can find. So what is the film about? It's about the use of modeling in everyday lives. There's a problem that needs to be solved, a table arrangement, and it shows us the steps used to resolve it. The last step of the process, manipulating the model, I think is the important one. The way the hostess presents various seemingly infinite configurations is the way the Eameses conceived a mathematical formula. And the pleasure here is not in the party itself, not in the application of the formula, but in the manipulation of it. The party is largely the play with the model, and the Eameses notoriously avoided parties. It's also the case that the party itself, like the pastry, is ephemeral. Nothing, presumably, is left over but memories. So I think the Eames' 1961 exhibition Mathematica is also a highly representative work. And it's also, I think, a point of strong contention with Neutra. I think this is set their collision course between the two of them. In his notes for the exhibition, Charles described mathematics as an abstract model of relationships by which we link seemingly unrelated situations. Linking seemingly unrelated situations. And he offers a few examples. A single grammatical diagram can be a model for several sentences with little else in common. 3 + 2 = 5 is an abstract model for any number of situations that have this characteristic. X squared over a squared plus y squared over b squared = 1 is a model for the ellipse that forms when we tilt a glass of water, or the ellipse that the Earth makes in its orbit around the sun. So very broad leaps in logic there. There are men who become so interested in abstract models themselves that their lives are spent manipulating models with no thought or concern for how it may be applied. So while it's certainly the case that the Eameses produce a great deal of work, artwork, furniture, toys, photographs, slideshows, exhibitions, films, indeed a staggering array of work, what the multiplicity of information was meant to convey was an underlying structure behind all the diversity. Jehane Burns, perhaps the most brilliant of the Eames office personnel, she was there from 1965 to 1988, described the Eames' style as the capacity for the design solution to contain a diagram of the problem. A solution contain a diagram of the problem. In other words, the product was not a finished thing for the Eameses. It wasn't a solution, but an expression of the elements that made up the problem. Once again, a kind of structural expressionism, if you like. And it's this vision of structure that was, I would say, most at odds with Neutra's sense of the meaning of architecture. One of the more striking moments in the simmering dispute between Neutra and Charles appears in a panel discussion held at USC in 1956. Charles and Neutra spoke back to back on the panel, and their talks were followed by a discussion. Charles took the lead and directed a pointed question at Neutra. I would like to ask Neutra whether in his book, Survival Through Design, he suggests a kind of suspicion of science, a suspicion that I think he does not really have. And Neutra retorted, no. A few minutes later, Neutra returned to Charles's accusation. I resent, Charlie, that you more or less imply that I walk around spreading a suspicion against science. I've been very much interested in defining what science has contributed, particularly that observation, curiosity, brings results. I think this is a defining moment in their relationship. I believe what Charles meant by suspicion of science is rather the identification of science with application. And I think the Eameses rejected that. Neutra, in fact, called his architectural practice applied biology. We're going to get to this in a second. It was the application of science that was Neutra's primary concern, and he considered the scientific attitude of detachment as behind some of the worst of human atrocities. In order to prevent the destruction of humanity, Neutra wrote, we need something very different from scientific aloofness. Neutra saw this aloofness as the defining attitude of a new generation of designers working with large corporations. Neutra condemned the Eameses' relationship with IBM, for instance. He saw the corporation as a soulless machine that turned human beings into abstract numbers on a readout. Neutra devoted the last 15 years of his career, 1955 to 1970, to the exploration of what he called biological individuality. Biological individuality. The individual character he thought was being systematically erased or eroded by the corporate designers with their inhuman play with numbers and figures. And now it's going to get strange for a minute. Because that's the kind of guy Neutra is, as you'll see in just a second. So here's the front and back cover of the book Charles mentions, Neutra's magnum opus, Survival Through Design of 1954. It's a very famous book, went through 8 editions and was translated into many languages. Very, very important book. The back cover of the book, here on the right, offers a fairly literal statement of Neutra's design theory. Standing against a white ground is a diagram of the human nervous system. The sinuous form poignantly overlays the steel skeleton frame of the Lovell Health House. The human skeleton is identified with the steel skeleton, both of them projecting a fragile inner life. At top left, untouched by the diagram, appears Julius Schulman's famous twilight photograph of the Kaufman House in Palm Springs. It's an image of the ultimate safety and pleasures Neutra's architecture could provide. And if there is one thought that defines the whole of Neutra's thinking, it's his famous reversal of Louis Sullivan's slogan, form follows function. Because for Neutra, function follows form. Our lives, he says, and he says this over and over again, are a consequence of all the shapes that surround us. Our lives are a consequence of all the shapes that surround us. Our built environment is our fate. Now, he put this idea very much into practice, and that's what I want to touch on right now, is to take you through one of his examples of what it means to believe that our environment is fate. And he had a very, very emphatic interest in educational environments for this very reason. He thought that the actual shape of the school had a profound effect on the education of the child. So I'm going to give you a taste of Neutra's approach as it appears in Survival Through Design in his discussion of classrooms. Neutra sums up a report by a D.B. Harmon working for the Texas State Department of Health. According to the report, this is what it says: a decrease in brightness contrast in the room produced stunning effects. 65% of refractive eye difficulties that were supposedly correctable by glasses only had disappeared after 6 months. Okay? So 65% of eye difficulties were, with improved lighting, got rid of issues that were normally corrected by glasses. 47% of malnutrition disappeared by eliminating muscular strain. And diet, Neutra insists, did not change at all. Okay. The benefits do not stop there. This is what he says: 40% of chronic infections, nose, throat, and ear ailments, and deficient functions were eliminated strictly by means of visual hygiene. And we're not done yet. 50% of dental trouble, obviously, due to faulty jaw positioning, is attributed to brightness levels in the room. Design solutions, he explains, are discovered through methodical electronic measurement of muscular innervation of the students. Anthropometric studies record habitual strain on the muscular and bone structure of growing children. And it takes us on to what might be described as a kind of clockwork orange. Chemical tests were made on children. Quantitative analyses of blood samples, urine, feces, the end products of glandular activity were statistically compared. There is, this is Neutra is continuing, recording and measurement of the disintegration pattern of the basic encephalographic sinus waves. Psychometrics, I have no idea what that is, were applied to gauge comparative mental achievement in detail. Finally, he says, through the use of biomicroscopic investigations, scientists could tell us exactly where deformations occurred in children who lived and worked in these spaces. More broadly, and this is essential to Neutra's view of things, Neutra dreamt of the moment when he could observe people in an experimental chamber suffering by cumulative irritation, which is scientifically measurable within so many minutes or hours of exposure. And I think we get a glimpse of Neutra's experimental chamber here at the 1955 National Charity League Observation Nursery School, with the extensive use of one-way glass. Teachers observe the children unawares, monitoring their lives in order to generate improved outcomes. The point, the Charity League is still there in Hollywood. The point of all this science of design is to persuade architects that it's their responsibility to collect all conceivable measurable data about the influence of their shapes on subjects, on the people in their rooms, and then deploy those measured shapes in the creation of ideal environments. And anything less, according to Neutra, is medical malpractice. While Neutra explored ever more extreme modes of scientific application, the Eameses turned increasingly away from making things and toward abstract modes of modeling. In other words, rather than the creation of physical objects, They increasingly pursued ideas and concepts, so much less furniture, much more exhibitions and films and slideshows. Here, for instance, are 6 photographs from their great slideshow, Goods. These are goods for the Eameses in both senses of the word. And the point of the slideshow was to explore the difference between application and model. Put out of use, bolts of cloth and kegs of nails suggest a world of possibility. The possibilities are endless. As Charles insists on the voiceover, the state of endless possibility, dreaming up what one might build or make with cloth or nails, is always better than the actual uses, the applications of them. The pleasure for the Eameses is in the manipulation of the model, not in the creation of a product. Neutra and the Eameses were really exploring opposite extremes. Neutra aimed to apply and test the latest science to every facet of life, while the Eameses, also appealing to science, explored the patterns behind every application. Their view of science was much more closely related to mathematics, something that Neutra was not interested in. Neutra, as I mentioned, was fascinated by the neurosciences. This is very much what makes him relevant today. And when he directed his attack at the Eameses, he used neuroscientific terms to defend his position. One of Neutra's guiding concerns, this is where it gets weird, or weirder, was to differentiate between recently accumulated layers of the frontal upper brain cortex against the deeper subcortical centers, where Neutra believed deep-seated realities of the biological common denominator resided. According to Neutra, much of the current confusion of design was due to the fact that it ignored the deeper layers of the subcortex of the brain and relied all too heavily on the superficial layers of the frontal lobe. Although it's hard to imagine, this distinction between cortex and subcortex maps on literally to Neutra's structures. Recall that Neutra's Bailey house, that's to say case study 20, and this house on the right, the Goodson house, extensively incorporate natural materials, wood, brick, water, opulent landscaping, and that those natural materials are applied to a supremely technological structure underneath. This slide, this is Strathmore on the left, this slide is meant to illustrate the difference between Neutra's early and middle or late work. The Strathmore apartments on the left from 1937 and the Goodson house on the right from 1948. Strathmore is stripped down, unornamented industrial design boxes. Goodson, on the other hand, is woodsy and plainer, spreading out into space. So how do we understand this change of approach from the early austerities of the Strathmore to the mid-century modern comforts of the Goodson? So this is what we associate mid-century modern with, much less the one on the left. What we call mid-century modern was, for Neutra, something of a ruse. These natural materials, the outer layer was the frontal lobe, the inviting surface that would slowly acclimate the resistant consumer to the deep-seated values of modern design. And Neutra could be rather literal about the analogy between architecture, body, and brain. On the screen is the plan and a view of the Goodson house. And I take the general shape of the plan, there on the left, to suggest the body of an upright figure. At the top of the plan is the pool or brain of the figure. You see the pool on the right here as Julius Schulman, the great photographer, has taken a photograph from the perspective of the diving board. For Neutra, the inhabitant literally dove into the brain of the structure, going down deep into the deep end or subcortex, where they would experience the lasting effects of letting go, of a protective bath, in the original experience of what Neutra called, frequently, interuterine suspension. Don't ask me questions about that. To be clear, so what I'm saying is that the main difference between Neutra's early work and mid-century modern work is the use of natural materials to create the very same designs as his early work, but stripped of any aggressive industrial surfaces. The appeal of mid-century modern is in those warm materials. But for Neutra, those warm materials were a necessary ruse to introduce contemporary reality into the brains of still backward-facing, cave-dwelling subcortex of the not yet fully modern subject. And these are the terms, surprising as it may be, that Neutra uses against the Eameses in his autobiography, Life and Shape, of 1962. There, Neutra attacks what he calls life-detached abstract speculation and self-satisfied electronically managed mathematics. These days, he says, statistical numerology has become tops. Numbers are our stop and go signals, says IBM. This is a reference to the Eames' famous early film, A Communications Primer, where they talk about in some good detail about the stop-go nature of binary code. Neutra continues, I do not act among a vast regiment of busy readers of regulation bulletins and what was assured by committee of upstairs sages as this year's or next year's best for the most, with those mosts and bests known to me only by round figures, handed down in inter-office communications. Where is man the individual? Is he lost in this progress of the numerical, which sits somewhere at our frontal lobe? Is it perhaps a retreat from total life? This is what it's like to read Neutra. As Neutra well knew, the Eames' Mathematica was sponsored by IBM, and the Eameses were heavily patronized by the corporation for the rest of their lives. Neutra seems to think that the Eames' vision of the best for the most for the least was a quantitative marketing tool. It was designed by bureaucracy. Neutra's stress, by contrast, was on the individual, specifically what he called the biological individual. His structures become more and more heterogeneous, increasingly fitted out to a highly specific biological makeup, as he saw it. As Neutra saw it, everyone looked at closely was what he called an individual phenotype, an evolutionary deviant, a genetic mutant, if you will, who potentially held the future survival of the species in their DNA. It's like a kind of X-Men moment for Neutra. The Eameses, as Neutra saw it, were focused on the statistical average, the normative subject, who was slowly eradicating the biologically singular, which held the key to our survival. So basically, Neutra thought the Eameses were kind of men in the gray flannel suit. It's kind of statistical corporate hacks, in a sense. Despite all of Neutra's stress on the holistic nature of design, the fusion of world and dwelling, there was for him an ultimate barrier to communication between individuals. Fearing the dissolution of the self in the Eamesian world of numbers, relations, patterns, and connections, Neutra turned all his attention in the end toward the deviant, peculiar, and specifically valuable individual. But what kind of individual is this? Neutra's biological individual has almost nothing to do with what we generally associate with individuality. This is a genetic individual, defined by their, quote, stomachs of different volume, shape, and position, windpipes of remarkably different diameter, so many oddities of variation. So he would presumably build houses based on these genetic variations of the client. The individual for the Eameses was far closer to what we normally think of as an individual, and it had nothing to do with their wiring or their biology. As Charles insisted on that 1956 panel discussion with Neutra, the new forces of design converged on the idea of total responsibility. Total responsibility. This is what Charles says, the extension of responsibility of each individual at every level of activity in all their lives. For Neutra, responsibility meant using all the latest findings of the neurosciences and deploying them in the creation of ideally healthful spaces. While for the Eameses, responsibility meant taking ownership of every aspect of our lives together. Neutra looked beyond conventions, beyond society, politics, culture, and meaning, towards some putatively deeper pre-human reality, a space of relief and withdrawal from the contingencies of social life. For the Eameses, there was nothing deeper than the human. The burden on us was to make meaning in a world we did not make, with conventions we did not invent. Our job was to make these conventions meaningful again by rethinking design from the ground up. Freedom wasn't somewhere beyond or before the human. It wasn't in their brain or their biology. It was with the human itself. For the Eameses, being a human was the greatest of all constraints. It was only through this constraint that any genuine connection could be made. Thank you.
I think Todd will take some questions if anyone.
Happy to.
I have a question.
Yes.
So after these two did their experimental houses and all those things, and you see you're talking about some very abstract ways they thought, but in reality, how was postmodernism grown out of this idea that these people were getting so mathematical and they seemed to be losing a human scale in their architecture?
Ooh, that's a big question. I tend to associate Neutra with postmodernism with his emphasis on individuated response. The Eameses think that they think in terms of expressive communication. They think that artists and architects make works and they try and get themselves across to another. Simple enough idea, but that idea actually became very controversial in the mid-60s when there's increasingly sense of commitment to individuated, discrete, different responses. And Neutra is not ultimately interested in the kinds of ways of understanding each other on some expressive way, but in trying to give voice to these very specific, diverse genetic features of our being. I know that sounds very strange, but so in a sense, I think the atomization of society into groups and identities is very much emerging out of Neutra's sets of claims. That there are these kinds of differences that make communication difficult or even impossible comes out of Neutra, whereas the Eameses really believed that if you took enough responsibility for your work, you could get it across to someone else. And if you are responsible enough to what they're saying, that is, you're sensitive enough and attentive enough to the care that they put into it, you could communicate. Whereas Neutra really thought we'd have to save these individuals from society, which is kind of wiping them out. And now there's a bit of a background to this, is that Neutra is, he's not a survivor of the Holocaust, but he is Jewish and grew up in Vienna. And there are some, these unpublished writings in the 40s, which are very much, I think he's associating science, a certain kind of science, with this abstract reasoning, which I think he thought lent itself to the fascist way of thinking about people. And he begins to associate that, strangely, with this whole trend in society towards statistics and numbers and mathematics. That is this kind of he hated the aloofness of it and detachment, where the Eameses are really going for detachment. They're just about playing with models and manipulating models. They get really into kind of model toys, and this kind of the modeling is what's interesting to them. Whereas Neutra said it's all about, in a sense, the application, and you can't have this detached view of the world. So it's very different from a kind of close orbit where they're working together, but I think it diverges quite dramatically. My bottom line argument is to say the thing that we call mid-century modern is not one thing. It is a multiple thing. And they mean very different, people meant very different things by it. If now it's kind of put together as a style, back then there were distinct arguments and views at stake. And that's what I'm trying to kind of recover. Yeah.
Is there anywhere I can go in one of these houses and sit in it and see how I feel?
That's precisely what he would want. Neutra absolutely thought, wanted and desired to hook people up, so you can kind of bring in now an fMRI and record them and measure everything that's going to them, so you can create something like the ideal environment. It's a kind of manic attitude. And this is what the bottom line is with Neutra, is he never lets go. He never just lets go and thinks, there's only so much you can do. You can kind of take responsibility and then you let go. He really thought he could create spaces which you could kind of quantify that would create a kind of ideal environment. So the survival through design is the idea that the environments that were not thought through and not measured are degenerating us, like continuously. All the time it's kind of raining down. So it's this kind of, he very much thought of it as a kind of low-grade radiation. So it's the nuclear age, right? It's 1954. But rather than a discrete bomb going off, your environment is slowly it's very California. The idea that the things around you are shaping you subtly over time and forever, and that you had to bring in the architect to save everyone, and that he can measure and quantify every last aspect of your environment to create healthy people. It's just very strange. But not that strange.
So are those Neutra houses, any of them open?
Yeah, sure. His own house, the VDL house in Silver Lake, you can see that. There's not a lot of them. Yeah, that's the one I would recommend, and you can that's open all the time. And that is very representative of Neutra's late work. So it's got, just look at the control panels on the walls. I mean, none of them work anymore. But you can see this kind of finessing of every shred of this space into that it's manipulable. So, I mean, he really thought that like different people's body temperatures, you can have a different room for the different body temperatures. And that you have panels on the wall, you can see that, how he thought in those terms. Yeah. So, yeah, the VDL in Silver Lake is one you can, there's a few, so, it's sad but true, but the very, very greatest, the very greatest of all Neutra houses is in Montecito, the Tremaine House. And unfortunately, it hasn't been seen by anyone that I know of. You've seen it? Oh, we need to talk. It's extraordinary, but never been able to get in, and you're the first person I've met who's had any access to this. So that's good to hear.
As you know, there's no outside windows. Everything faces in because of his artwork that was there.
Right.
A very private man, Warren Tremaine, and they said on his death, the Chicago Art Institute had trucks there taking out to Chicago so California wouldn't tax his art.
Right.
So they're just driving down East Valley Road with the church.
Right.
But that was built in the 50s or 60s?
48.
48.
Yep. Yeah.
On Moore Road.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Who owns it now? Do we know? Can I knock on the door and say, I've been to this lovely lecture?
Oh, they're used to it. They have.
Yeah. And they say no.
Yeah. Well, there's a brand new Neutra film that's going, just released, and it's going around, and they couldn't even get in. So we've tried. Yeah.
Early on, you showed a slide of an early Neutra and a later Neutra.
Yeah.
The later one had a lot more wood on it.
Yeah.
Was there a reason for moving toward the wood orientation?
Yes. So it's one of these things that's kind of strange. They're very austere box-like structures, the early ones. And then beginning in 42, they warm up immensely. So lots of wood, much more landscaping, lots of pools, these kind of planes that go out and reach out into the environment, these kind of spider legs as they're called. So much deeper integration with their setting. What we tend to call mid-century modern is the warmer version of modern architecture, right? So it's that stuff, less the early stuff, less the austere kind of Germanic version. So as I was saying, this is how Neutra thought of it. He thought that it's a bit of a ruse. He's like, wow, these people want their wood. What can I do? No one wants only Hollywood elite want my places. How do I appeal to the masses? You warm it up. And it's got a cynical side to it, that you put these kind of outward layers on it which are appealing to people, and you will, over time, they will imbibe modern design in this slower manner. So you can't just charge in. He obsesses over the question, how do I make modern architecture accessible to people? Why don't they want it? He could never imagine the idea that some people just don't want to live in a modern house. That just never dawned on him. He's like, it's true and good. It's obviously true. So he had this distinction between the true and the good. The early stuff is the true. The good is the way you package it. So you give them the good so that they will take in over time the true. And that would be my definition of mid-century modern for a strong part of it, which is to say the kind of wood surface. It's a surface of which there's a kind of the underlying stuff is what he really thought was taking hold of people.
So was his use of wood then a sellout?
Well, I think it was all about, many modern artists think this way about persuasion. How do we get people on board? Modern artists have been concerned about this since the beginning. They're going out in front, and they're getting, it's a high risk. And how is it that you can make this appealing to people? I mean, one of the funniest versions is, right, Arnold Schoenberg. It's probably apocryphal, but Arnold Schoenberg presumably said that the mailman would be whistling 12-tone someday. It's like, they will never be whistling 12-tone, like ever. But the idea is that if you just gave them the right tools, enough packaging, if you just sold it to them in the right way, it would all take hold and everything would become modern. And they all believe that, which, understandable to a certain degree. But there is a kind of a sense in which he is doing it as a marketing device. I mean, it's more than that. But it has that dimension to it. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Neutra house on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco? 1939.
Mm-hmm.
The owner, Jack Whedon, died recently. It's going on the market in June, so I thought this gentleman not only could sit in there, he could buy it.
So there's 3 Neutras four in proximity. There's the Tremaine house in Montecito. There's a Slavin house in 20-minute walk from here. There is a house in Hope Ranch, and then there's there's a very, very great one in Ojai called the Moore House. One of his very, very great houses is there. It is. I mean, look, this is a tough part about this business is if you go to an artwork, you can usually get to see a painting, but seeing someone's house is a different thing. There's no museum for them, so it's an ongoing challenge to get inside. It's many years, so you just got to work your way. I don't remember. Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. Yes, that sounds right. Yeah.
First of all, I think this is really fascinating, and thank you so much for framing what seems to be a relatively simple question of a familiar thing and making it so absolutely odd. So that's really illuminating right there. But in terms of the use of organic materials and mid-century modern aesthetic, it just sort of occurs to me, maybe it's common knowledge in the study of this material, but the Japanese version of the significance of nature and living with nature, is that perhaps sort of a reaction to the turmoil of the world wars in that context and kind of nostalgia for reclaiming a different version of things disrupting the Western version of art and science? Because it seems to me that a lot of what you're describing are the poles that really come out of Bauhaus and Bauhaus reception in America, especially with relationship to other artists like, Cavendish, for example, and his relationship to MIT, and this whole notion of discovering the principles of scientific design with no application, and this whole notion of play, which also has really interesting overtones in terms of your work with Matisse and the kind of Kantian version of producing purposeless objects. So, I'm sorry, that was a very complicated question.
There's a lot going on there. The Japanese thing, so right, that emerges in the early 30s, that kind of fascination and fixation. Then it's famously, there's a major exhibition on the Japanese house at MoMA, so it becomes much more kind of well known and established as a kind of, they didn't know what they were looking at a handful of photographs of Japanese houses as their model. And the Eames house was used for these Japanese tea ceremonies. There's a famous event where Charlie Chaplin is there and they do this elaborate tea ceremony at the house. So one of the absolutely foundational questions of mid-century modern is the relationship between a kind of organicism and high industrial technology. If you think of like a John Lautner, who uses the most high-tech imaginable technology to produce like a tree, a house that looks like a tree. And that kind of friction, so a kind of Japanese organicism, craftsmanship, handmade with steel, thermopane windows, and lots of gadgets in these houses. That's never been properly kind of understood, I think, but I think that is at the heart of this. The idea being that through technology you can get closer to nature. That was what they believed. It was so that the level house is this kind of steel cage stuck into a ravine, into this very kind of luxurious setting. But there's not a lot of integration of the two. It's just like, technological, the most high-tech house imaginable machine in the garden. So that runs deep in this moment for sure. Yeah.
I'm just thinking also in terms of the aftermath of all this that gets us to the crate and barrels of the world.
Yeah.
And also with the reaction to the obliteration of Japan through science and what that unconsciously or consciously signified for a culture that's really decimated itself by this very act.
Yeah.
That's the culmination of everything that the Bauhaus didn't want to happen, everything that Moholy found
right.
was just exactly the wrong course. So anyway, I just wonder whether or not that's a reflection, advertent or not, in trying to recover this inside-outdoor organic sense. The landscape in particular of mid-century modern houses is so overwhelmingly, it seems to me, Japan-inspired.
Yes.
So it's just sort of an interesting, I don't know what to make of it.
Yeah. It is, it's an ongoing question. So what is it about mid-century modern that people like now? What is it, why are people drawn to it exactly? People are not interested for good reason in 80s furniture. So it's not just a kind of marketing thing. I don't believe that. I think there's a genuine interest here, but it's not people living through it, right? It's not nostalgia, because they weren't alive. So I have all kinds of theories as to what it is that's going on. It's holistic, it's idealistic, it's fun, it's mobile, it's kind of inexpensive-ish. But why? What specifically is? Think this is what's interesting is like how many times has modern art filtered down into society at large? Mid-century modern, like Walmart has a whole line of mid-century modern furniture. What Impressionism is the only other version of this I can think of, where you have a kind of wide-scale, ubiquitous, filtering down of modern art into society at large. So what is it that's? People have thoughts on this. I would love to hear. What is it that is that in particular people are getting out of it?
Well, if you look at the chair that you're showing there, you can see that actually a body would fit it.
Yeah.
You can see your body, parts of your body's molded into it, and there's a human sense of scale to it.
Yeah.
And I think that thought, that deep thought about it, and that it has a lot of other things that it looks like a thing that can get up and gallop away, and it has, like you said, the fun parts.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a lot of stimulation on a lot of levels that I think attracts people. Lighting and a lot of things.
Yeah. No, that's a good reason. The Eameses were great. I think that's a very legitimate answer to the question. This just is really great furniture. I tend to agree with that. I do think that Eames furniture is exceptionally well made, but it's more than that, though. I mean, because people aren't really buying Eames furniture. I mean, they are, but that's not essentially what they are. They like the whole vibe of it. Yeah. So. Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's terribly uncomfortable.
Fair enough.
For short people.
Right? Yes. Yes.
But do you think that maybe Cliff May was became Neutra's he was able to fulfill the everyday or common person's dream home by having, he mid those same organic homes, but at a price that everybody could actually afford.
Yes.
Didn't Cliff May work with him?
Nope. No, I think Neutra, I've never seen him mention May, but I think that Neutra would reject May because it would be taking the frontal lobe part of it, the outside of it, without the inside. So,
since I lived in one, yes.
That's if we take his terms to understand this stuff. I think he would reject it as being just the surface and not the modern underlying structure, which is what he wanted to communicate.
But it was a way for everyday people to come up with a mid-century or a modern house.
So this is a really good question, and I can come up with a very boring answer to give you statistics about how much these things cost, which is not nearly enough part of the literature on this is the cost. The case study house is roughly the most extravagant, with the exception. Well, let's take the most expensive of all the case study houses. Number 22, the Pierre Koenig one, the famous one with all the the models take their shots there. The pool overlooking cantilevered over the Hollywood Hills. That was $50,000 in 1960, which is a lot of money. It's about it's about $250,000 now. Which you cannot buy a stitch of land in that area for that much. So the most expensive house that they built has no relation to contemporary reality. The median home income, median house price in Los Angeles now, I think is right around $700,000. So you could not buy anything. So I'm willing to give them a bit of a pass on this, in that they weren't, and they normally would cost between $12,000 and $18,000 in this kind of late 40s through mid 50s period, which is pretty reasonable if you compare it to today's dollars. But no doubt Cliff May was less expensive. Neutra could do the whole shebang. He could do his clients were very often teachers, and the Goodson House they made it themselves. So just gave them the plans, and they acted as their own contractors, made for very little. So there's a wide range. I would say there's a wide range in these houses.
I'm familiar with a lot of mid-century architecture in California. Was there a movement in Europe as well that you would classify as mid-century or not? Is it all West Coast stuff?
So the Germans, and so Neutra is Austrian. R.M. Schindler, the other great Los Angeles-based architect, is Austrian. They came in early 1920s to Los Angeles. The Germans left Germany in the 30s after the closure of the Bauhaus in 1933 and went to the Northeast primarily, or Chicago. So they opened the new Bauhaus in Chicago in the late 30s, and Walter Gropius goes to Harvard, Mies van der Rohe goes to Chicago, opens the IIT, still there. So they disperse to the United States, and then they create a whole bunch of students. And yes, I would say that would certainly be mid-century modern. So mid-century modern Chicago, very much a thing. I live in a mid-century modern house in Princeton. So they're all over. They're all over. they're in the South, or South Carolina's got some great ones. Yeah.
Did the Eames design whole houses the way Frank Lloyd Wright and the Green Party did, with everything, the lights,
Yep.
the rugs, the furniture, the whole package, the turnkey thing?
So one of the most interesting facts about the Eameses is they stopped making architecture. So they built their house. They built a Herman Miller showroom at the same time, 49. They built a house for Herman Miller in Michigan in 53. That's it. And Charles built some earlier churches early in the 30s. But that's it. So they're literally done making houses and architecture by 53. But there's only one house in the 50s. So it's a very interesting story. The responsibility of making architecture was too high, as they saw it. That if you are making an environment and you are responsible for, in a sense, what happens there, they couldn't see themselves doing it. So they can make it for themselves, they can make it for their friends, let's say, the Herman Miller family, but they wouldn't make it for other people. So they really did go towards this modeling direction, so not making houses, not making architecture. In terms of creating like holistic green, Frank Lloyd Wright spaces, I think Neutra absolutely follows in that pattern, in the idea that they don't look the same, but he thinks every single shred of it. He could tell you everything about the handles in the kitchen and the wallpaper and the floors and the curtains, and everything would have meaning for him, and would be ideally for him measured in its effect. So I think he is very much in the tradition, and survival through design is dedicated to Frank Lloyd Wright. Strangely, he named his first son after Frank Lloyd Wright, so he's very devoted to Frank Lloyd Wright. But it is Wright never imagined that you would calculate the effects of his houses on people. He would think that's absurd. So he's still, I think Neutra's in that tradition, but I think he thought of it in a very different way, the holistic nature of it.
Well, maybe take one more question, so we can leave in one more. You asked why people are attracted to mid-century modern. I would say, in general now, there's a movement away from clutter. And something like that appeals to people. So, a woman recently wrote a book called "Your Kids Don't Want Your Stuff."
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, you could also say that maybe people don't, I mean, as things get in a bit more austere, that you don't, if you're the Walmart version of this, you don't have that much stuff. So it fits that, a kind of reduced lifestyle in a sense. I think there's many reasons, but it's
There's a Japanese woman who said you should only have 30 books and.
No, sure, absolutely. Okay.
Well, I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.